trade and industry is given the opportunity now to do so.
Mr. Speaker, I thank you sincerely for the opportunity to make this all-important policy statement as Caretaker Minister for the Ministry of Trade and Industry on behalf of the government of President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo on consumer protection in Ghana, one of the most important right issues in a free market like ours. Mr. Speaker, exactly 1 month from today, on 15th March 2023, the world will be celebrating Consumer Rights Day, a day set aside to raise global awareness about consumer rights and needs, to advocate for the respect and protection of the rights of all consumers, and to protest against market abuses and social injustice that undermine consumer rights. Mr. Speaker, the issue of consumer protection, though of recent development, has been the concern of governments from ancient times. In most traditional societies, families produce for themselves majority of the goods they consume, and for the goods they could not produce, a barter system ensued, a fair exchange of goods for goods to balance what each family could not produce. With increasing trade in barter, there was a need to regulate trade to ensure what was generally termed, quote, measure for measure, end quote, and promote fair trading of goods. In the United Kingdom, for example, Mr. Speaker, as far back as the 10th century, under the reign of King Edgar, prior to the Norman conquest, a law was proclaimed to control the weight, measure, and prices of wool. In subsequent years, similar enactments were made for bread, corn, meat, and a host of other essential commodities. But it was the Sale of Goods Act of 1893 which formed the basis of present-day consumer protection in the United Kingdom. In the United States, Mr. Speaker, consumer protection is usually traced to the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914, which established the Federal Trade Commission to, among others, regulate unfair methods of competition in commerce. Today, Mr. Speaker, most countries have consumer protection policies and legislation that secure the rights of consumers against unfair practices, such as Australia's Competition and Consumer Act 2010, Canada's Consumer Protection Safety Act 2010, the UK's Consumer Rights Act 2015, South Africa's Consumer Protection Act 2018, and India's Consumer Protection Act 2019. Most jurisdictions have also special institutions that deal with consumer protection, such as the Competition and Consumer Commission of Australia, the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Commission of Nigeria, the Competition Commission of Kenya, and the Competition and Consumer Commission of Singapore. In our case, Mr. Speaker, attempts to protect consumers predate our attainment of independence with statutes like the Weights and Measures Ordinance 1896, Cap 188, and the Control of Prices Regulations 1949, number 25 of 1949. These attempts continued after independence with the enactment of the Rent Stabilization Act 1962, Act 109, Price Control Act 1962, Act 113, and the Sale of Goods Act 1962, Act 137. As remarked by the venerable jurist, His Lordship Justice Datiban, in his article titled Legislative Control of Freedom of Contract, and I quote, "The Control of Prices Act 1962 was a statutory weapon adopted by the government to combat the market forces in the interest of consumers and the economy," end quote. Mr. Speaker, despite these efforts, we have not been able to develop over the years a single legislation for the protection of consumers. Currently, our legal and regulatory framework for the protection of consumer rights is fragmented in different pieces of legislation, amongst them being the Public Utilities Regulatory Commission Act 1997, Act 538, the National Petroleum Authority Act 205, Act 691, the Electronic Communications Act 208, Act 775, the Public Health Act 2012, Act 851, and recently, the Ghana Standards Authority Act 2020, Act 1078. This phenomenon has led to the creation of different bodies with different jurisdictions over different aspects of consumer protection, such as the National Communications Authority in respect of electronic communications, the National Petroleum Authority in respect of petroleum products, the Energy Commission and the Public Utilities Regulatory Commission in respect of the supply, distribution and sale of electricity and natural gas, and the Bank of Ghana in respect of banking services. Mr. Speaker, this state of affairs has long been recognized as undesirable. It has led to a significant part of the market remaining unregulated in terms of consumer protection, leading to a constant violation of consumer rights without adequate remedy. In those areas that seem to be regulated, there are instances of jurisdictional conflict among the various regulators, leaving the consumer with no remedy. In short, consumers are not getting value for money. For example, today, it is not uncommon in our country, Mr. Speaker, to enter into shops and see signs such as, quote, goods sold are not returnable, end quote. So what protection does the man who buys clothes from this shop, which do not fit, get? What is the remedy given to the woman who buys a phone charger and gets home only to notice that it does not work? And what protection is given to someone who consumes food or beverage and suffers injury thereafter? In most cases, consumers who seek to vindicate their rights have resorted to the courts, relying on common law principles of contract and tort, which impose a higher evidentiary burden on the consumer. For example, Mr. Speaker, in the case of Nana Tebiri Jansa III versus Accra Brewery, suit number 8136805, decided by the Court of Appeal on 10th March 2006, a consumer who bought 2 bottles of Castle Milk Stout and suffered injuries after consuming half a bottle of the drink was left without a remedy on the ground that he could not prove the negligence of the manufacturer. In the words of the court, Mr. Speaker, and I quote, the plaintiff did not lead evidence to establish a nexus between his permanent and temporary health injuries and his consumption of the defendant's manufactured Castle Milk Stout, end quote. Mr. Speaker, these complexities, coupled with the general lack of consumer awareness, lack of access to the courts, absence of low-cost, quick, and accessible fora and methods for resolution of consumer complaints, low level of consumer activism, and considerable institutional capacity constraints require a legislative intervention to ensure that the rights of consumers are adequately protected. The respected professor of law at the University of Ghana, Professor Christian Dewuna-Hammond, was spot on when she concluded in her 2018 article on consumer law and policy in Ghana as follows, and I quote, the overall consumer protection regime in Ghana remains inadequate and uncoordinated in the absence of a comprehensive and harmonized policy, legal and institutional framework, end quote. The need for such legal framework has long been recognized. The Ghana Trade Policy 205, for example, proposed the establishment of a consumer protection authority to facilitate consumer remedy, establish codes of practice on advertising and labeling, educate consumers on their rights, strengthen consumer-oriented organizations, and ensure effective representation of consumers on decision-making bodies. This was re-echoed by the Consumer Protection Policy of 2016. Mr. Speaker, the state is required by Article 35, Clause 2 of our national constitution to seek the welfare of all citizens, and as a respected member of the international community, we are enjoined by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, to institute a functional consumer protection regime to protect consumers, as well as enshrine their rights in the marketplace. It is to fulfill these obligations that government, under the able and distinguished leadership of the President of the Republic, His Excellency Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, is working rigorously to ensure the passage of a consumer protection law. I am happy to announce, Mr. Speaker, that in the coming days, I will be signing a consumer protection bill, which will be laid before Cabinet for its consideration and possible approval, and subsequently for the consideration of this august House. In this regard, kindly permit me, Mr. Speaker, to pay glowing tribute to officials of the Ministry of Trade and Industry for the tireless work they have undertaken in getting this bill this far. The overarching objective of the bill is to protect, secure, and defend the rights of consumers through a structured institutional mechanism and legal framework that will ensure that consumers play a significant role in keeping erring businesses in check, promote competition, and ensure regional integration through digital trade and e-commerce. Mr. Speaker, the days when people depended on what they produce are long gone. Today, everyone depends to some extent goods and services provided by others. The market dependence of consumers has increased considerably, making it imperative for us to protect consumer rights. With the coming into force of the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFTA, and as host of the AFTA Secretariat, consumer protection law is more important now than ever. The government of President Akufo-Addo is fully committed to the passage of this law. It is my hope that when the time eventually comes, after the bill has passed through the scrutiny of the cabinet of President Akufo-Addo, this House will respectfully support government to pass this very consequential legislation. I thank you for your attention, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, Honorable Ablakwa.
I'm most grateful, Right Honourable Speaker, for the opportunity to make a brief comment on the policy statement that has been presented very eloquently by the caretaker minister at the Ministry of Trade and Industry. Mr. Speaker, I must commend the minister for apprising the House. I have noted with delight that this particular minister always keeps this House informed on matters that are in the works, that are being considered by his ministry and by the executive for that matter. Sometimes even before they get to cabinet for cabinet consideration. And Mr. Speaker, that practice is very commendable. And I recall that the Right Honourable Speaker himself has urged ministers to follow this path so that Parliament will be brought along, so that we do not become, if you like, just a dumping ground for bills that have been concluded by the executive, where we were not consulted and our views were not considered and were not factored in the bills or policies before they are implemented. So, Mr. Speaker, since this has been a matter that you yourself is on record to have urged ministers to follow this path, I want to commend the respected Minister for Lands and Natural Resources and Caretaker Minister for Trade for following this shining example.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, for giving me the space to make a very brief comment on this very, very important statement, which has been put together by Honourable Samuel Jinapor, the Minister for Lands and Natural Resources, who currently is a caretaker Minister for Trade and Industry. Honourable Speaker, I'm excited that this particular minister, at his debut and triumphant entry into this House, has had a very positive effect on me. Anytime he stands to deliver anything of consequence in terms of our government and where we are going, I find that there is a lot of research and industry. I commend the minister for this kind of culture, a culture of research and intellectual powers. And I pray that nobody should say that this is your first time of coming to Parliament and therefore you wouldn't want to be counted as a strong person in this august House.
Let me, on your behalf, thank the Minister for always giving Parliament prior notice of very key interventions that the Ministry wants to make, particularly dealing with policy and legislation. I think the industry of the Minister needs commendation, and I'll call on other ministers to emulate that good example. not just in this regime, but in the future regimes. We expect to see that cooperation between Parliament and the executive. It gives us enough opportunity to do research, prepare, and then make inputs into what government is going to do. There are a lot of key policies that we are having challenges with now in this country because Parliament was not involved at all. I think that the minister has given a very good lesson of himself, and we all need to commend him. So, Minister, high recommendations from the House, continue the good works, and I'm sure, essentially, the President himself will accordingly reward you. Thank you so much for coming.